Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Edina Silvestri.
Hello guys, and welcome to episode 25 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today marks the end of our Movies That Move Us series. Today we talk about the movie, or the movies, in the franchise Star Wars. And I have a special guest that I want to welcome you to, or introduce you to. But before we get to our guest, I think you're going to like this episode. It was definitely wide-ranging. We talked about the first couple of episodes of Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and then we went to some of the more modern episodes, and we look at religion throughout the franchise and how George Lucas has a focus throughout the movies and what he wants the audience to take from it. And it may not be what you think. And so we talk about that. We talk about the hero's journey, and we talk about the Force. Of course, we talk about the Force and how it's everywhere and it connects us to one another. And maybe you're a Darth Vader, maybe you're a Luke Skywalker, and maybe you're both. So on to our guest, Reverend Edie Weinstein. Delights in inviting people to live rich, full, juicy lives. She is an internally recognized, sought-after, colorfully creative journalist, interviewer, author, and editor, a dynamic and inspiring speaker. She's also a licensed social worker and interfaith minister, bliss coach, event producer, certified laughter yoga leader, certified cuddle party facilitator, and cosmic concierge. Edie is the founder of Hug Mobsters Armed with Love, which offers free hug events worldwide on a planned and spontaneous basis. She speaks on the subjects of wellness, relationship, trauma recovery, addiction, mental health, spirituality, sexuality, loss, and grief. Edie is the author of The Bliss Mistress Guide to Transforming the Ordinary into the Extraordinary, and co-author of Embraced by the Divine, The Emerging Women's Gateway to Power, Passion, and Purpose. She has contributed to several anthologies and personal growth books, including Taming the Anger Dragon, From Pissed Off to Peaceful. Her work has been seen in BeliefNet, Elephant Journal, Psych Central, The Huffington Post, The Good Men Project, as well as a growing number of other publications. She was the host of Vivid Life's It's All About Relationships on Blog Talk Radio for more than 3 years. Over the past 30 years, she has the honor of interviewing many celebrities and influencers, and one of my personal favorites, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The last 4 decades, she has worked with those who have been diagnosed with life-altering conditions, including mental health issues, cardiac disease, cancer, multiple sclerosis, infertility, end-stage conditions, eating disorders, addiction, trauma brain injury, stroke, depression, and anxiety. Her focus is on her clients' resistance and assists them in developing a solid toolkit of personal coping skills. As both a clinician and a patient, she is aware of what it is like to be on the other side of the treatment relationship and can be of service to the patient, their caregivers, as well as their treatment team. Edie can assist with the issues that arise, such as body image, trauma, sexuality, relationship changes, vulnerability, changes in physical or cognitive ability, aging, end-of-life issues, and communicating needs. Okay, if you want to learn more about Reverend Edie, you can go to her website, and there are other ways that you could reach her, but one way is www.opti-mystical.com and email bydivinedesign@comcast.net, and I'll link to the other ways you could meet her on social media. All right, guys, on to our show. Edie Weinstein, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm honored to be tapped to be on the show.
So today we are talking about the movie Star Wars and our Movies That Move Us series. And I want to start there with the first time that you saw Star Wars. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. 1977 was the year that episode 4, A New Hope, was released. I was sitting in the back seat of my friend Joan Wesley's father's car. She and I had gone to school together. She moved from my town of Willingboro, New Jersey, up to New York. And I don't remember where he was driving us, but her brother, who was kind of a geeky, nerdy kid, had a little tape recorder. And he says, you got to hear this great music. It's from a movie. It's a soundtrack from a movie that's going to be out soon. And he started playing it, and I was hooked. I said, I got to see this movie. Because I really loved science fiction growing up, was fascinated, watched Star Trek throughout my entire childhood. And I said, I got to see this. So that's when I first went to see it. I don't even remember who was with me. I don't remember the theater, but I do remember being so captivated by the trilogy, the first trilogy of Star Wars, and that was it. And I've seen those episodes several times. I have to admit that I'm not anywhere near as well versed in the later ones, including the more recent ones.
Well, what was that experience like? How did you feel?
I felt like I don't even know what to call it, another world, obviously, because that's what was portrayed there, was a whole other world. And I felt captivated is the word that came to mind. And I identified in some ways with the Princess Leia character. I laughed at the costuming and the bluster and bravado of Han Solo and their bantering back and forth relationship. And there's another really cool, now all these years later, really cool connection. My son and daughter-in-law got married 2 years ago, and he's into Star Wars and she's into Harry Potter. So the cake topper on their wedding cake, the line that Han Solo and Princess Leia exchanged, where she says to him, I love you, and he says, I know. Well, that was on the cake topper. And then the Harry Potter reference was the word always. So I don't know whether either one of them have taken the other to their favorite movies, but who knows, maybe that seed was planted so that my son could be interested in Star Wars as well.
That's great. So I want to ask you a question that I ask most of my guests. Let's start by talking about your spiritual background from childhood.
Sure. Well, I was raised Jewish. I went to Hebrew school from the time I was probably 6 or 7 till I was 16, became a bat mitzvah. And back then, in the 1960s and 70s, girls and women were not considered of equal status or standing in the synagogue. Were not permitted to be part of what's called a minyan, which is a quorum of 10 people that are necessary to say certain prayers. Women couldn't wear a tallis. But I grew up in a family where my father, who was very active in the synagogue, wanted his daughters, my sister and me, to feel like we were not second-class citizens. So he would take us to synagogue. And on the Jewish High Holy Days, when men would wear tallis, the prayer shawl, I would sit next to him and he'd wrap it around my shoulder. So he taught me to be a little subversive. That way, kind of snuck me in. And they had a Sunday morning breakfast club for the boys that included prayers and ritual. And my sister and I broke the gender barrier. And then other girls came into it. So I grew up practicing Judaism in my home, but not just the ritual. There's a term called tikkun olam, which is repair of the world. So a lot of it was peace and social justice. That has stayed with me. I'm now an interfaith minister. I was ordained in 1999 from the New Seminary in New York, and they ordain interfaith clergy. And the school was founded by a rabbi, an imam, a priest, and a minister. So it's sort of like the opening line of a joke. And what I say is, I don't tell anybody what to believe spiritually. So again, I do believe in something. I see it more as an energy than an entity. And I believe that prayer is portable, that it's not necessarily praying to an entity or an energy for intervention, but the shared force. And again, that ties in with Star Wars, the shared force that we all have when we set intention together. So that's my spiritual journey.
It is ongoing. It is ongoing. Thank you for that. So I deeply enjoy everything about Star Wars. And I love that there is this that there was this seismic sort of shift from the old Jedi movies to the more recent ones. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, as I said, I haven't seen too many of the more recent ones, but I like the idea that there's a timeline that goes back and forth. And that with each movie, there's a sense of strengthening about what the Force is. That's the biggest piece for me. I also, do you know what Reiki is? Are you familiar with that?
Can you explain modality? It for us? Yeah.
Reiki? Sure. It's Reiki, and it's universal life force energy. You know, like the word chi or ki or prana is that life force energy that permeates everything. And that to me is what the Force is. And you use it for good. It's a healing modality that can either be done hands-on or sent from a distance. I mean, if you can rub your hands together and just feel the energy and the heat between them, that's what Reiki is, although there's a training and an attunement that goes along with it. But if you notice everything is energy. So when I think about the Force and how how the understanding of it evolved in all of the movies, I realize that we all have that ability. It depends on how we cultivate it. What's that term they use? Midichlorians or whatever, that the whatever factors are in somebody's blood that indicates how tapped in they are to the Force. I don't know if there's a real test for that, but I've always had a sense that without even knowing the languaging, that I've been a Jedi in training probably all my life. And I was a really quirky kid. I would tell my parents that I was an alien baby left on their doorstep. Even now, my sister rolls her eyes at her weird sister. So I like the idea that it shows that there are other people in the movie that possess that ability and that want to do something about it, want to be able to cultivate it and strengthen it in their own lives.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in my work, I work with women that are struggling with substance abuse issues and eating disorders. And one of the key components to our therapy is that you have the answers. Maybe the script in your head is a little faulty. You can't talk to yourself about yourself to yourself, especially when you're depressed, so we work on that in therapy, but undoubtedly I feel like you do know the answers. Yeah. Oh,
absolutely. I've been a career therapist for 40 years and I sit with people every day who have experienced trauma and in some cases addiction. And what I tell them is that, I'm a guide, but I don't have all the answers. And together we can explore the answers and help you figure them out. But ultimately, you live with you 24/7 for the rest of your life, and you know your life better than anybody. So I totally agree with you. So imagine what it would be like. And I think I'm going to use this today in like I'm seeing clients all day. I'm thinking use the idea that what if you were a Jedi Master without a light? You don't need a lightsaber. The lightsaber is within you. That's just a tool. Lightsaber is just a tool. But what would you do if you knew you had your Jedi powers? So I'm going to think about that today, like what I would do differently if I could tap into that all throughout the day.
I love that. So I thought we could talk a little bit about good versus evil.
Well, that's the theme of the movie.
It's the whole point. It's the whole point. And so, maybe even just talking about Darth Vader versus Luke Skywalker, it's sort of like this interplay between good versus evil, and who are you today and who were you 20 years ago? And
Right. Well, one of the things that I like, and I forget if I think it was a Yoda quote, to look that up, that anger leads to the dark side. Now, anger is a normal human emotion. And I tell my clients that all the time, but it's about what you do with it. You can use it as a tool for positive change, or you can use it as a weapon. And what happened is that, Anakin Skywalker, aka Darth Vader, used it as a weapon, that he let his ego take over. He let that overshadow the goodness that he had experienced, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. We see that out in the world today with everything going on, with all the, the anger, the hatred, the violence, the lying, the cheating, whatever, all that goes on in the world. So it was an evolution, or a de-evolution, if you want to call it that, with Darth Vader, that he de-evolved from somebody who was kind and caring and used his intelligence and creativity, unfortunately, for evil as opposed to good. And Luke is part of him. And I think it was one of the biggest shocks for Luke to find out, like, oh my God, this is my father. Because all along he had no idea who his father was. And when he discovered that, it was oh my goodness, like, what does that mean about me? And the scene that I talked to you earlier about before the show was when he was confronting Darth Vader in the cave, and he had he was in training with Yoda, and he had the lightsaber, and I can actually hear the sound like where he lopped off Darth Vader's head. And when he looked at him, he said he saw his own face, so he knew that he was being tempted by the power of of what he had experienced. So one of the things that I loved about his relationship with Yoda is that Yoda helped him, just like a good therapist, to harness the power and use it for good and not let it scoop him up and run away with him.
Yeah, and Darth Vader wasn't born evil.
And I don't think anybody, I mean, there are people that are hardwired, like people that, that are psychopaths, that may be considered wired for evil behaviors. But I believe that redemption, and this is not in a religious sense, but we can redeem ourselves, which is something that Darth Vader's character did. When he died, he was saving saving lives. So it is possible.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit more about redemption, and I really want us to talk more about forgiveness. Can you do evil things and also have the self-forgiveness, but then also hold yourself accountable?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And you nailed it. There's a difference, I think, between doing evil things and being evil. And I've struggled with that concept all of my life, where I denied that there were genuinely evil people. But I think there are very wounded people out there. And I think the ones that are most expressive of that evil energy are very wounded people. And when I work with abuse and trauma survivors, I tell them it stops with you, that your history is not your destiny. And that's I've never heard it said that way in Star Wars, but that's a very Star Wars theme. But just because Luke and Leia came from Darth Vader, they also came from Queen Amidala. Is it Amidala? Yeah, Queen Amidala. So they had both, and it was an either or. And they both had, I'm assuming, had to come to terms with their parentage and how, is it nature versus nurture? So the forgiveness piece, you nailed it when you said self-forgiveness has to come first. Because in some ways it's easier to forgive other people than it is to forgive ourselves. I still struggle with that. There's some things that I wish I had done differently in my life and that I have regrets. And beating myself up over it as a recovering codependent and recovering workaholic isn't going to change the past. It's not going to make me any happier or healthier. So that's when I have to come to terms with choices that I made based on fear and anger. Again, part of the dark side. I see an article percolating. I'm also a journalist. So I see an article percolating from our conversation here. So forgiveness doesn't mean it's okay. It just means that we're human, that we're going to do things that are not in our best interest and not necessarily in the best interest of the people in our lives. So I'm learning to forgive myself and other people who I feel at times have, I hate to use the term, done me wrong, but that's kind of what it feels like sometimes. But again, maybe that's an illusion too. Everything that's ever happened has been a learning experience for me. Now, I'm not saying we have to attract things to learn stuff, because that feels very victim shaming. But I realize that if something happened that was hurtful to me, I can use it to evolve. Fertilizer helps plants grow, so I can look at it as fertilizer.
Yeah, no, that's great. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, talked about wanting to do more than entertain the masses. He said he wanted to introduce young Americans to spiritual teachings through new myths for our globalized, pluralistic millennium. And I thought, wow, that's so true for some of the newer Star Wars movies.
Yeah, well, that ties into what we talked about prior, was the hero's journey. And for those of your listeners that may not be familiar with it, I mean, he didn't make it up, but he brought it to popularity. It was Joseph Campbell, who was a philosopher and a writer, a mythologist, if you want to call it that. So he talked about the idea that the hero or heroine, it starts out in an ordinary world. And everything, like with Luke, he was living on Tatooine. He was with his widowed mother. Life probably felt a little constraining and boring for him. And then there was a call to adventure. So he finds the message in R2-D2's little memory banks where Princess Leia says, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." And then he's off to the races. Then he refuses. He says, "Nah, I'm not going to do this. It's too scary. Who am I to do this?" We doubt ourselves all the time. You think about your clients, my clients, they say, "Oh, who am I to be out there in the world? Who am I to be successful because my abusive mother told me I'm nothing?" Then he decides to do it after his aunt and uncle are murdered. And then he meets his mentor, and that's Obi-Wan. And he learns more about the Force. Then they call it crossing the threshold. So he crosses the threshold of the journey where they have that wild gathering on that planet, the cantina scene. He starts to, gets into a fight, and then he realizes, okay, I've got this ability. I'm going to use it for good. Then he gets tested. They're allies or enemies. And then he goes to that inner cave that we talked about where he confronts his inner Darth Vader. And then there's the ordeal, and he's got to struggle with all that. And then there's the reward. So he gathers his abilities, and then he heads back. And then there's this, what they call it, the resurrection. Again, not necessarily religious, but when we're resurrected from the depths, we rise above. So that happens whether you're spiritual or not. Because you think about our clients, how many of them have risen from the depths of their addictions, from the depths of their abuse. And then he comes back with what they call the elixir, which is the treasure. So I think that's what George Lucas was alluding to. Again, not in his brain, but that I'm imagining. Can you think about that? And the movie The Wizard of Oz is sort of the same thing. There are tons to look up the hero's journey in the movies, but definitely look up hero's journey in Star Wars. You're going to see a ton of stuff.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap up, I want to know what you think, or what is your favorite part of the Star Wars movie? And it could be any part. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, the scene was the first one, then Return of the Jedi, and then what was the third one? No, The Empire Strikes Back was the second one, and then Return of the Jedi, where at the very end, where the Ewoks were celebrating after they blew up, in the Death Star, and all these little creatures are dancing around celebrating, and you see the gathering of the tribes. You've got, in spiritual form or not in physical form, you got Obi-Wan Kenobi, you got Darth Vader, looking like his human self. So that's what we're seeing there, and that's my favorite. And when Han Solo realizes that Luke is not competition for Leia, that's her brother.
Surprise.
That's my favorite. So the romantic in me liked that part, and the spiritual warrior, if you want to call it, like the part where even when they're all out of their body, even though they're all dead, they're still there. Because I've experienced a lot of loss in my life. My husband died when I was 40. That was 21 years ago. My parents are both gone, but I feel them around me. So that's my favorite scene.
Yeah. I love when Yoda is burning the texts. And this is, I think, the last movie that has aired. And, he's trying to shock Luke out of these old religious texts that don't mean anything, and trying to shock him out of his guilt and shame about the past and make him focus on the now. And I thought, well, that's pretty Buddhist.
Yeah, I've got to watch that. Like I said, I haven't seen the last few movies, and I'm hoping to see the one that's coming out now. And maybe I can snag my son.
You should snag your son.
Yeah, and see if he'll see it with me. But that sounds marvelous.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up our Star Wars movies that move us?
Yeah. I encourage people to use the Force in their life for good, not for evil, and to trust that it's always there. It's never not there. And I look at the Force as love, that love, not necessarily in a romantic sense, but that heart-to-heart connection. Oh, quick story. Remember I told you about meeting a Darth Vader
Yes.
character? A couple of years ago, I was doing, I do free hugs, where I'm one of those people that go out and hug strangers by consent. And a few years ago, I was at the 4th of July parade in Philly, and there was a whole contingent of people dressed in Star Wars costumes, including Darth Vader. So I approached him and I asked if he wanted a hug, and he agreed. And I said, I suspect that bad guys really need hugs. And he said, bad guys need them more than anybody. So if you can hug that bad guy in yourself, if you can hug somebody that you perceive as being a bad guy in your life, not necessarily male, but a bad, some concept, some person that, not if you're endangering yourself, but that judgment, like let go of, if you can, of the judgment about that person being bad, unless they really are, but again, hug your own Darth Vader. Maybe that's a better way to do
I believe so much that, we start to believe that negative self-talk that we say to ourselves. It's even helpful just to write down all the negative things that you say about yourself and, just sort of stare at it and be the observer. And, you wouldn't talk to your best friend like that. You wouldn't talk to your 5-year-old self like that. So, yeah.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. So be kind to yourself,
Be
people.
kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being on. And what are some of the ways that people can find you and all the awesome work that you do?
Thank you. My website is www.opti-mystical, mystical.com. Where that came from is that a few years ago I get messages from whoever, and it said, you're not just an optimist, you're an optimistic who sees the world through the eyes of possibility. So it's www.opti-mystic.com. I'm on Facebook as Edie Weinstein. That's EDIEWEINSTEIN. And I'm pretty active there. My son calls me a Facebook addict, but I use it a lot for spreading the word about all kinds of pieces, social justice kind of things. And as a writer, my articles are up there too. So those are the two best ways to reach me.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Enjoy your day.
You too. Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.